Claim faith, and yet they are not believers in God, maybe at all, or maybe they're at least not Christians when we come to the New Testament. And so we're going to see that here in Matthew chapter 8 with a particular individual who is a centurion. And so we'll take a look at this story, and we'll take a look at this individual, and we'll see what we can learn about faith in general, about our faith, from this particular example. And this one, maybe of all of the ones we look at, is worth looking at because Christ himself is impressed by the faith of this man. And if Christ is impressed by his faith, then isn't it worth a little bit of our time to look at what that faith was in this individual? So, we'll start at the very beginning of chapter 8 of Matthew. It says, when he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. All right? That's a little bit of context, except if you just leave it at that, that's simple enough, but what mountain and what crowd? Well, you go back to the last 3 chapters. Jesus has just finished the Sermon on the Mount. And so when it says that he's come down from the mountain, what it's saying is as soon as he finished the Sermon on the Mount, while the crowds were still at his heels, these are the events that start to take place. And so he's just gotten done, and the very next thing that happens in verse 2, behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift of Moses, or the gift that Moses commanded, as a testimony to them. So, this is not the encounter that we're looking at this morning, but it does give us a nice way of contrasting this event and the one that we're about to look at. This will sound strange because anytime that you see a miracle take place, it is something that is spectacular. It's something that's supernatural. It's by definition out of the ordinary. And yet, this is kind of an ordinary miracle. Now, how does that work? Well, this man, one, is a Jew. We see that in verse 4. Jesus tells him, go show yourself to the priest. Well, you don't do that if you're not a Jew. And so it's a Jewish person, someone who already believes in God. And this rabbi has come along, this teacher, and he says, this guy's doing some impressive stuff. Maybe he's a prophet. Maybe he can heal me. And so he goes to him, and he goes physically to Christ. And Christ physically lays hands on this individual, and he displays his faith. We're not doubting his faith or his genuineness at all. What we're saying, though, is this is someone who already believes in God, believes this guy can perform miracles by the power of God, goes to him, has hands laid on him, and lo and behold, he's healed. Okay, that's kind of the standard format that we see miracles take place in. That's going to be a lot different from what we see in this next encounter. And so just keep that in mind as we look at the rest of the story here, because this will be a contrast that we'll use. So continuing on, verse 5, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, my servant is at home, paralyzed and dreadfully tormented. Jesus responds and says, I will come and heal him. Okay, we'll stop there for a second. So Jesus has entered Capernaum, not a maybe particularly major city of the time. It was along the Sea of Galilee. We see a lot of other events take place there. But apparently it did have a Roman garrison, because you don't need a centurion somewhere that you don't have a garrison station. And so we run into this individual, though, this centurion. And so we're going to say a few things about centurions in general. That will also be true for this individual. The first thing, of course, is the very definition, which, as a lot of you will probably know anyway, is kind of misleading at this point in history. While centurions did start out being commanders over 100, that's where you get that century word in there, by this time they're probably commanding more like 80 legionaries, Roman soldiers. And that would be a lot due to cost and to different military issues of the day, but he would be in command of a lot of people. Now, centurions, though, as a general rule, were promoted from within. That means within the group, the 180 soldiers. And they would be promoted based on a few different reasons. A lot of times they were promoted based on physical ability, meaning they're the biggest, they're the strongest of the group. Sometimes it was based on skill. That is, they are the most capable fighter among that group, and so they are the natural choice to be the leader. But because this is a leadership position, it's not all about just physical stature or stamina. They also had to prove themselves to be able to lead, but also be men of character, men of valor. There are specific accounts of centurions that were promoted because they were the first to jump over a wall to face the enemy. They were the first to go into battle when maybe everybody else was being a little bit hesitant. And so you want those kind of people to be in these leadership roles. So he had to have shown some ability, and then also he probably was an intimidating guy anyway. He wasn't someone that he was someone that you might be afraid of in the first place, someone who's physically commanding, because they kind of had to be that. But the other thing that centurions were both known for and required to do is to be disciplinarians, because it is their job and their personal responsibility what happens to that unit. And so if that unit performs poorly, or if they're out of line, this individual will be held accountable. And so they became symbolized by a grapevine, which seems kind of strange, except that the grapevine was used as a whip or a club to enforce discipline within that group. And so when he starts to talk in a minute about having authority and understanding authority, this kind of gives us a little bit of background for what that authority really looked like, and that he knew what it was like to be in command, necessarily. The other thing, though, that he brings up is that his servant is ill. Now, there's two ways you can take this. One, the more generous way of looking at it is he's concerned for his servant, which seems likely, that he has actual compassion for his servant. Maybe he's had this servant a long time. We don't really know. The more cynical view is maybe he's just looking at this saying, this guy's, it'd be hard to replace him, it'd be expensive, it'd be a whole process, and so I don't want to have to go through that. But we can probably be a little bit more favorable toward this individual and say, yeah, maybe he actually is concerned. The other thing that this shows, though, is that this centurion has a little bit of status, a little bit of wealth even, because even being a centurion, that doesn't guarantee that you can afford a servant. But apparently he's doing pretty well for himself if he can have this servant, and then he also shows this concern for him. So Jesus offers there in verse 7 to come to his house and to heal his servant, which is a good thing for Christ to do. But the immediate response in verse 8, the centurion answers and says, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. He starts out with the truest words that anyone can speak when they come in contact with the Son of God. He says, Lord, I am not worthy. Now, whatever else follows is going to be true too, but he says, I'm just not worthy for that to even happen. And so he recognizes that, but he recognizes something else here as well. Not just that he's not worthy, but that Christ has such power and such authority that it's not necessary for him to physically come in contact with his servant. It just isn't needed. Instead, he can just say the word, and his servant's going to be healed. Well, that's a good understanding from, again, not a Jew, not someone who has background in all of the teachings of God, but instead this Gentile, this pagan, this Roman. He says, you know what, this guy, everything I've heard about him, he's powerful enough. If you'll just say the word, then my servant will be healed. And so there is faith, but there's understanding as well. In verse 9, he says, For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, Go, and he goes, and to another, Come, and he comes, and to my servant, Do this, and he does it. And so he says, both in my role as a captain of this group of soldiers, I can command, and they'll do, and to my servant, I can command, and he'll do. And so he understands authority. Now, the implication of that is what we're concerned with. Because he doesn't really explain it. Christ doesn't really explain it either. He just makes a statement. But there's an implied understanding of something. So what is it that the centurion means when he says, I know what it's like to have authority, and I know what it's like to be under authority as well? And I think there's probably two ways you could take this. There's probably more than two, but two simple understandings. One, he could be looking at Christ and saying, since we're talking about illness, and we're talking about whether or not you need to come to my servant to heal him, he could mean that, Lord, I know you have authority even over disease. I think that's probably fair. I know that you have authority to heal. I know that you have this authority given to you. And so, it is enough for you just to speak, and even this illness will obey. Sort of like even the winds and the waves will obey. But here, even a sickness is not above your authority. The other way that he could mean this is, I recognize that you have authority not just over healing, but you have authority over me. Now, for him to say that is a pretty big statement coming from the societal levels that these two are on. If he says, I recognize that you have authority over me, what he's saying is that I, as a Roman citizen, number one, number two, as a centurion, who is a well-paid professional soldier over a large group of people, but number three, that you, as a Jewish carpenter, that you have authority over me. Does that sound right in the society in which they live? By all standards, the centurion is on a higher level than Christ is. How many servants does Christ have? None, not in that sense. How much authority does Christ have? How many people does Christ command? In an earthly sense, none. And so when he recognizes this authority that Christ has, he's really giving up all of his earthly authority, the centurion is, which again shows some faith, but also some recognition, some understanding of reality beyond what most people are able to recognize here. And so Christ responds to this, and he says in verse 10, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. So again, here's the contrast. He says, I've looked throughout Israel, I've looked among the Jews, and I haven't found this. And that's true here, and that's really going to be true going forward. It's not a whole lot of the time that Christ is going to find someone with this level of faith, with this level of understanding. But it's also kind of a referendum on Israel, isn't it? When he looks at this man and says, by comparison, even in this land that are supposed to be the children of God, that are supposed to be so faithful, I've not found it. It's just not there. In spite of everything that they're supposed to be, they can't even rival this pagan in terms of faith. From there, he's going to go on in verse 11 and give sort of a prophecy concerning the Gentiles and what will happen. He says, I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Real quick side note here. If you were here Sunday night, we had a lesson talking about our understanding of what the kingdom of heaven is in reference to the parable of the vineyard owner. Well, this verse goes a long way in that same discussion to say that the kingdom of heaven includes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if you'll remember what we talked about, and also that the sons of the kingdom, that is the Jews who were already in the kingdom, will be cast out. So very similar idea to what we said there. But what Jesus is doing in the context here is he is showing that this one example is not going to be a standalone example. This one Gentile showing faith and being added into the kingdom, that's going to become the standard going forward. That the Gentiles as a whole will be added into the kingdom as the Jews reject that same kingdom. And so that'll be the case, the global pattern from now on. And then verse 13, Jesus says to the centurion, go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that same hour. We get to see the efficiency of the miracles of Christ. It's not that he says, yes, he'll be healed, and then a few days later, and after he goes to the doctor, eventually he gets better. It's immediate, at the same hour. And I'm sure that just as we see in other miracles, he came home and somebody told him, it was exactly 10:38 that he got better. And the guy thinks, yep, that sounds about right. That's when Christ said the words, and my servant was healed. Christ also makes the statement, though, as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And so essentially he's saying, if you have the faith, then let it happen the way that you believe. And we'll talk more about that as we go on, but if you do believe this, then your desire can be accomplished. If you don't really have the faith, then it's probably not going to happen the way that you want it to work out. So he puts that kind of on the centurion to say, as you believe, it will happen. Not just as I have the power to, but as you believe it. So what do we take from this example of this one individual, especially considering his background, not being of the household of faith from the start, not being a Jew, not being as familiar with these things? First, we could probably say this, pretty common lesson that you can learn, but don't judge a book by its cover. We could take that a couple ways here. First, we could take that by physical appearance. Like we said, this individual, by necessity, is going to be a pretty rough and tough character. He has to be. He wouldn't have survived this long, and he wouldn't be promoted to this rank without being just that. And so you look at this physically intimidating person, and yet, as much of a warrior as he has compassion on his servant, and he has faith enough in Christ that he can heal. The other side of that, though, is that he's not just a soldier, but he's also a Gentile. He's a representative of Rome, an occupying, oppressive force for the Jews. And you look at that and you say, well, this man shouldn't have any faith. Not compared with the Jews that surround him, but he does, and Christ recognizes it. He also has compassion, like we said, but one thing we didn't point out before, when in verse 10, Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith in Israel. It says right before that, when Jesus heard it, he marveled, he's impressed, and he said to those who followed. So he's speaking with the centurion, but all of a sudden he turns around to his audience that came down the mountain with him, that have been listening to the Sermon on the Mount, and he tells them, I haven't found such great faith in Israel. Well, one, that's kind of a slap in the face to say, you all, among you, I haven't found such great faith, my audience. But the other reason that he does that is because while he's impressed by this man's faith, imagine the shock of the Jews when they hear the faith of this man. Again, it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that this pagan, this Gentile has more faith than them. That's exactly what happened. And so Jesus turns to the crowd to say, hey, look, I found greater faith right here than I found even among you. The second thing, though, along with that, and this is more for us individually, don't be surprised when you find great faith outside of your own group. So we'll have to be a little careful how we say this, but we kind of expect that we have a monopoly on faith sometimes, or that we have a monopoly on sincerity, and that's certainly not the case. In fact, sincerity and faith don't mean that you're right, but what we do see is sometimes the people who are most sincere about what they believe are maybe the most extreme. That is, some end up in cults or almost groups like cults, and you say, well, they may be wrong, but at the same time, there's a level of sincerity there, a level of faith and genuineness that maybe we don't even see. Now, that's the one extreme, but what I'm really trying to say is don't be surprised when you look at a group that's outside of yourself and you say, wow, that person has a lot of faith, because then you end up in the same position as the Jews here. To say, well, how could there even be faith outside of the Jewish nation? Well, how could there even be faith outside of the people that I know? And yet, a lot of times, that's where you're going to find the greatest faith. The third thing in this story is, third lesson, is to surround yourself with faithful people. There's another story that takes place with Christ and with someone being ill, and people, in that case, bringing this individual to Christ. And you remember the story. There's these four individuals, these four friends, we usually call them, that bring another man who is in desperate need of Christ. They can't get to him immediately. They break through the roof. They lower him down. And we always point out in that story, rightfully so, that it matters who you surround yourself with. And that's true. But I think it's worth pointing it out in this story too, maybe even more so. Those men had enough faith to bring their friend to Christ. This man has enough faith that he doesn't even need to bring his servant to Christ. Instead, he just says, you know what? All I've got to do is go and ask. And if I have the faith to do that, then my servant will be healed. That's part of the reason that we're comparing this miracle to the other, to say that while there's nothing normal about a miracle, the one that happens at the beginning of chapter 8 here is kind of the standard, where it's a Jew that comes to Christ and Christ makes physical contact with them and they're healed. Here, it's a Gentile that comes to Christ. And instead of physical contact, it's a faith and a recognition that says it doesn't even matter if he touches Christ. All that matters is that Christ approved the act of God being done, and this man will be healed. So, the next thing that we can say, and this comes directly from the statement that he makes in verse 8, the centurion does, none of us are worthy of being healed by Christ. And we mean that more in a spiritual sense than we do physically, although it often applies physically to us as well. But none of us are worthy of that. And the faith of the centurion doesn't really make him worthy of it either. So we don't want to fall into a trap of thinking that because this man or any individual in the New Testament comes to Christ in faith, that faith has made them deserving. Because he recognizes, he owns it from the beginning, I'm not worthy of this to happen. But that's the exact example of faith that we do have to have, a humble faith that says it's not my faith that's able to save or to condemn or to heal. It's my willingness to come to Christ and then his willingness to act on my behalf. And so again, we look at this example and we say sometimes faith has to go beyond the obvious, the normal, the standard. If this individual had said, after Christ offers, I will come and heal him, if he said, great, come on to my house and we'll have this guy healed and everything will work out, it probably still gets recorded, but it's no different than from the miracle that happens above. And there's no greater faith that's displayed. The greatness of the faith is the response. It's the response that says, you know what? I appreciate your offer to come to my house, but number one, I'm not worthy. And number two, you don't need to because you have so much power and so much authority. And I understand just a little bit of that authority, but you know what it's like to have all authority. And so all you have to do is say the word, and I understand that my servant will be healed. The one other thing that we will mention before we finish is this, that sometimes, this goes to verse 13, sometimes our imagination, that may not be the right word, but sometimes we limit what God can do. In verse 13, to remind us of the statement, Christ says, go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And so we look at that verse and we say, okay, if our belief is that God is able to only do this much, then only this much is going to happen. Because essentially what Christ says is, as your faith will allow it, so let it be done. Well, if my faith says that God can do a lot of nice things, but I don't believe that God can really do this, well, then is God going to do that? If this individual, if this centurion believed that Christ was able to heal only by physically contacting somebody, then would his servant have been healed? Not unless Christ comes to his house. But he says, as you have believed, so let it be done. If you think that I can heal your servant just by speaking a word from across town, so let it be done. And so the concern is for us, do we ever limit what God is able to do? Not because God is unable to do it, but because our faith is unable or unwilling to believe that God is able to do it. And so if you look at your own life, you can apply that pretty well. If you look maybe at the church and you say, well, I know that the church could grow twofold. We could outgrow this building in a year, in theory, but I don't really believe that God could make that happen. So is it going to happen? Well, of course not. Because we've limited what God is able to do because our mind is too small to imagine what He is capable of. But of course, if God is only able to do what we think is possible, then we're in a lot of trouble anyway. Because my mind has trouble comprehending how God, in His grace, could save anyone. And so if I limit God to what I can understand, it's never going to work out. But this story, this example, it's worth looking at not just because it shows faith, but because it shows faith from an outside source, as we've been trying to do this year. But the message overall is, number one, to come to Christ. The story only happens once the centurion makes the choice that he is willing to come to Christ, that he's willing to make a change in his life that will ultimately affect not just him, but will also affect his servant and probably a lot of other people as well. The second thing is to recognize that after we come to Christ, it's not by our greatness, not by our faith, but by His doing that we're going to be saved or going to have anything done on our behalf. And with that comes a humble faith that recognizes Christ has the authority, I don't, but Christ has offered that if I'm able or if I'm willing, as I have believed, so let it be done for me, for you. This morning, the invitation is to come to Christ. The invitation, if you've already come to Christ once in your life to be saved, then there's never a wrong time to come back to Him. This really isn't an example of salvation this morning in the story. It's an example of someone coming back to Christ because they have need of Him. And all of us have a need from Christ this morning. Whatever that need may be, if the church can assist, we ask that you come forward with that, or go to God if you need to. If you will, come as we stand, as we sing.